To start off then, I'll get my dope, which I decant into little tammy jars because it's a bit easier. And then I just put a small amount on a little brush and paint onto the framework. Probably use a little bit too much there, but I can spread it around. This is a little bit fragrant stuff, but I've got quite an understanding wife, so she doesn't really mind even though I'm doing it inside the house. First side done. I tend to use the dope neat when applying it to the framework, but you could thin it down. I'm not saying that it's right or wrong to use it neat, it's just always what I've done and had good experiences with in the past. So now that's been covered, I'll just pop my lid back on because it's stinking out of the room. I'll let that sort of go tack dry. If you apply it when it's damp and you have to move it, you can end up with areas of the tissue that have got quite a lot of dope on, and that's not really what you want. It can spoil your finish a little bit. Right, so now that that's tack dry, it dries very quickly. I've got some pieces of tissue. This is some Asaki that I had left over from when I built my Peton pole. And as simple as this, you just lay the framework on the mat, check shiny side down, lay it on top of the framework, and then get your thinners. I tend to use the same brush throughout the process. There's not really enough dope on it to make it an issue. If you're doing a larger model, you'd probably want to use different brushes and not contaminate your thinners. Once it's laid on top, hold it in place and just dab on the thinners, which soaks through the tissue and will activate the dope underneath. You can use this quite liberally because most of it just evaporates off. You may get a few wrinkles at this stage, but you can just pull them around your fingers while the tissue is still damp from the thinners. I don't like to pull them too tight on tail planes because Asaki has quite a high shrink and I don't want it to end up looking like a banana. As you can see, it's starting to wrinkle up a little bit, so I'll just have to ease that around. as I'm doing a demonstration video, you can imagine this is not going as well as it normally would, but such is life. And then just let that dry off. It'll dry off pretty quickly. It's like the dough pit, gases off very fast. So you've done one side and then just repeat this on the other side. I prefer shiny side down because it means it's easier to slide the tissue around for those inevitable wrinkles. Now that both sides are covered, I'll leave that to dry. Just pinch out any last little wrinkles. You can see with the sake, even from the moisture on my hands, that it's starting to shrink slightly. Well, you've got to be careful with tail planes. I don't tend to pre-shrink my tissue, but I understand the merits of doing so. So now I've trimmed the excess tissue and laid down the edges. With this white sake, when it's on the frame, it pretty much goes translucent, which if you're trying to get a bolder colour, you might want to try something else. But now that the tail plane's been covered, I've trimmed off the excess tissue. It's ready for water shrinking now, so I'm not going to teach to suck eggs. That is just, I've got a small atomizer and I give it a light spritz with water. Literally just a few pumps until the covering starts to sag, and you can see it's quite damp there. In fact, just like to lift slightly on the trailing edge, so I'll just lot a bit of thinners on there, otherwise it won't shrink correctly. Things never go to plan when you're making a video, I suppose. That should be okay. Might get a little wrinkle, but I can ease that out after. And then normally I'd pin this down and I'll leave it for a period of up to a week sometimes, between two books, and that just allows it to remain flat while it's shrinking. But as this is a demonstration, I'm just going to let this one cure without pinning it down. The tail plane has now dried from the water shrinking, and it is nice and tight. You can see the covering. Where the tissue had lifted slightly, I seem to have got away with that because there's no wrinkles, so I'm happy with that. And it's relatively flat considering it hasn't been laid between two books, which I normally do. So now I'm going to apply the banana oil, which doesn't get on with this cutting mat too well, and it can leave green marks if you leave the wet surface on the cutting mat. So I've just put some cellophane over the top, and that'll stop it from discolouring. Right, so I've decanted my banana oil into a small Tamiya pot. I use it neat. Different manufacturers, it might come in different viscosities, but the stuff I've bought, which is the Guild Materials, it seems quite easy to brush on, so I just use it neat. I use quite a big flat soft brush, and I probably use too much when I do my models, but I'm not building for competitions. So, and this is literally just a case of brushing it on. Only slightly dab the brush as it wicks straight up, and it can absolutely soak the brush, and you don't want using loads, especially on a tailplane. And then quickly just brush it on. I do both sides at the same time. As I said before, I don't know if this is right or wrong, but it's always worked for me in the past. The only problem with these brushes, they can shed hairs now and again, as this one has. So I'll try and get that off, otherwise it will prove difficult to get off once it's dried. So once that's done, I let it gas off for a bit. Again, this dries quite quickly, like the dope, which is another benefit of using this process, because you know it's fairly quick. You're not waiting days and days for it to dry. So when I dry my tissue, if you put it on a flat surface, it will dry and it will stick to the surface. With the cellophane, it's not too much of an issue because you can just peel it off, but it does leave a sort of pattern almost behind, which isn't very nice, and can ruin the finish slightly. So what I tend to do, I've got some scrap balsa, and you probably can't see on the camera, but it's just got sellotape over the top, which makes it non-stick or less stick, and I just lay that on the board underneath the frame so you can get circulation of air and it doesn't stick to the board. So I've got various different bits that I use. Just put that on there. Obviously make sure you get it the right way up, because otherwise, if it's not against the sellotape side, it will stick to the wood. Ask me how I know. It's a little bit fiddly because it wants to move all the time. Right, and then just for the tips. That's on there. So normally I'd use my magnetic board and I'd put my magnets along the edge. I use ferrite magnets, and in the past sometimes the sort of black dust from the ferrite can get onto the tissue, which is a bit annoying. So as this is not for going on a model, I'm just going to weigh it down slightly with some Tamiya pots. And whatever else I've got laying around. So I'll just let that dry. Probably takes about 5–10 minutes to be fully dry. So I'll come back to that in a minute. So now the banana oil's dried, we've got a nice tight covering. I'm going to add the second colour of tissue. You can do this with lettering, insignia, or anything you want. I tend to always use a Saki because I'm lucky enough to have quite a lot of it. But it does work with domestic tissue as well. And this is very easy. So this has got the banana oil in it that's dried now, leaves a nice finish. And you get your coloured piece and you lay it on top. I always go shiny side down in the desired position, and then take your thinners and just dab it onto the tissue, and it will soak through, activating the banana oil. And adhering it to the surface. The tissue that I'm adding on top has not been shrunk or had any treatment at all. It is just plain tissue straight off the roll, or in this case from the offcuts folder. Sometimes give it a light rub with my finger just to make sure it's adhered all the way along, which it is. And then I just wait for that to gas off and dry. Now that the thinners have dried, I've trimmed the edge and folded it over slightly. I'll leave just a little bit overlapping. One, because it is stronger, and two, because it looks better. Normally you can just fold it down and run some thinners around the outside and it sticks down with the banana oil from the previous coating. But if it's not going down correctly, you can add a little bit of dope or a little bit of banana oil and a bit more thinners just to stick it down. So almost there now. We've got our initial covering on with the banana oil, the coloured strip of green across the back, and then the last thing to do is to give it one more coat of banana oil so that the finishes match and that it penetrates through the coloured tissue to give a nice finish, and it means that it sticks better to the overall covering. It would help if I use banana oil and not dope. That would not be the desired result. So scratch that, there we go. And fresh brush. And there we have the finished tailplane. As you can see, it's nice and smooth. The green tissue doesn't sit too proud, so you're barely noticeable to the naked eye that it's different tissue. It's smooth around the edges, and overall it leaves a nice finish. You could potentially cover this in two different bits of tissue because it's got the spar, but that might lead to problems with warping when you shrink it. So I prefer to do the airframe in one initial colour and then cover with other colours to get a pattern. You can use this for lots of different techniques, so camouflage, insignia, registrations, that sort of thing. Here's a couple of examples of models that I've used it on. There's my Skip Town Cadet. It's a pet kit. It's got a little bit of damage on it, as you can see. This is the same again. This is two layers. This is not one on top of each other, but on the wings it's exactly the same method as we've just been through, and on the tailplane. And more recently I did a vintage model company Spitfire, and I did all the camouflage on that using this method, and that came out really well. It was quite tricky, trying to get the parts to match up on the fuselage. We got there in the end. It's not perfect, and the scheme is sort of made up, but I think it looks reasonable. So thanks for watching. I'm sorry it's such a long video, but I didn't realise how long these things take. And if you've got any questions, just feel free to comment and I'll hopefully answer them. Thanks.